Blood-red sunrise bled across the volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, turning black ash into a field of burning embers. The first waves of Marines lay motionless where they fell, rifles buried in the grit, boots half submerged in rising tide. Then, through smoke, fire, and the thunder of artillery, figures emerged. Young black Marines of the 8th Ammunition Company and 36th Depot Company. Men the Japanese had been told would never fight, never stand, never endure. Their gas masks dangled, uniforms torn, arms shaking as they dragged crates of mortar shells across open killing ground. Machine gun fire stitched the sand at their feet, but they kept moving. When white units ran dry, these men sprinted into hell to resupply them. And within hours, the enemy stopped laughing. The volcanic sand of Iwo Jima swallowed boots like quicksand, each step a fight against the island itself. The Japanese had spent years transforming this rock into a fortress. Tunnels, bunkers, pillboxes cut into the earth like arteries. The air stank of sulfur, cordite, smoke, and blood. Marines of every background, state, and race fought through the ash. But among them were men whose presence the world had doubted. Black Marines of the 8th Ammunition Company and the 36th Depot Company. The very first African Americans ever to land in a U.S. Marine Corps assault. Their orders were simple: land under fire, carry ammunition to the front, and keep the fight alive. What no one planned for was what happened when those missions turned into full combat. They came ashore on February 19, 1945, in Higgins boats battered by rough seas. Their helmets rattled with every shell burst. Some were barely 18 or 19, too young to drink, but old enough to die on black sand that burned their palms when they crawled. Japanese artillery found the first wave immediately. Shells crashed into landing craft, shredding metal, men, and supplies. Ammunition crates tumbled into the surf, shells hissing as cold seawater hit them. A corporal shouted for his men to move, and these Marines, men who had trained separately from white units, men forced to fight for a chance to even serve, sprinted through machine gun fire with boxes weighing 100 pounds across their shoulders. Their hearts pounded, but they kept moving. They had waited their whole lives for a chance to prove themselves where it mattered most, in war, under fire, where no prejudice could shield the enemy. The Japanese High Command had dismissed black troops as inferior, claiming they lacked discipline and courage. Those misconceptions dissolved the moment these men hit the beach. Mortars exploded overhead, volcanic ash rained down, and the wounded cried for corpsmen. But as white units advanced inland, they found their ammo running dry faster than planned. The enemy's resistance was too intense. Rifle clips emptied, mortar teams burned through shells, and machine gunners shouted for belts. Waves of Marines, seasoned, experienced, exhausted, looked back toward the shoreline, unsure how supplies were supposed to reach them through the torrent of steel. That was when the 8th Ammunition Company broke across the open ground again. No cover, no trenches, just fire, smoke, and black sand. They ran in teams, bent low, helmets ringing from shrapnel. Some dove into shallow craters when machine guns found them, then burst forward again, dragging crates with torn hands. One Marine, Private James Oliver, fell when a bullet punched into his shoulder, but he pushed himself back up, gritting his teeth, refusing to drop what he carried. He knew the men up front needed ammunition more than he needed rest. Some Marines lifted wounded comrades as they carried supplies, refusing to leave anyone behind. A white Marine sergeant from the 5th Division would later say, "They did the bravest damn thing I ever saw on a battlefield." Because these men were not expected to fight, they were expected to serve. But war cares nothing for expectations. And when the second wave broke under murderous fire, the line between laborer and warrior vanished. Black Marines loaded rifles from the dead, dug firing positions, and filled gaps in broken platoons. They fired back. They defended wounded they'd never met. They dragged ammo to foxholes, then grabbed rifles and shot until barrels smoked. Even veteran officers hardened by Guadalcanal and Tarawa watched in disbelief. The Japanese had predicted these troops would run. Instead, they advanced inch by inch across the killing ground. When sunset bled across the island that first night, fires burned everywhere. The beach was strewn with bodies. Craters glowed with molten lava exposed from bombardment. And there, among the wreckage and smoke, were the silhouettes of the 8th Ammunition and 36th Depot Marines, still hauling crates, still reloading mortar teams, still fighting with whatever weapon they could find. No one doubted them anymore. Even on the first night of the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history, they had earned a place no prejudice could erase. The second day on Iwo Jima dawned without color. Smoke and ash turned the sky gray, and the rising sun looked like a pale coin behind a curtain of sulfur. The wind carried the smell of burned fuel and bodies. Marines were already digging in, trying to carve shelter from a battlefield that offered none. The Japanese had not retreated a single inch overnight. Their machine guns were buried under layers of rock and concrete. Snipers fired from tiny slits melted into the steep slopes. Every inch forward cost blood. The Black Marines of the 8th Ammunition Company and 36th Depot Company had barely slept. Their uniforms were stiff with dried sweat and black soot. They ate cold rations kneeling in the sand, helmets tilted back to gulp air that tasted like smoke. Some tried to joke to stay sane. Others simply stared in silence at the shattered landing craft littering the tide. They were supposed to be behind the fighting, moving supplies. But the front was everywhere. Shells rained down without warning. When mortars slammed into the beach, the ground jumped beneath them like a heartbeat. One blast opened a crater so wide that several Marines slid into it, trying to shield themselves from shrapnel slicing overhead. When the barrage lifted, officers shouted the next impossible order. The white infantry up ahead had burned through ammunition again. They needed grenades, mortar rounds, and 30 cal belts. Without them, they would be pushed back into the sea. No one hesitated. These men, many from Detroit, Chicago, Georgia, Texas, had been told by their own country that they weren't fit to fight. Now the fate of entire Marine rifle companies rested on their shoulders. They formed carrying teams and sprinted forward. Machine gun bullets chewed the sand around their boots. Mortar shells burst in black plumes that erased visibility. Some Marines dropped to their bellies and crawled, dragging crates inch by inch. Others ran upright, refusing to waste time. A few were hit. Crates exploded from their grasp, ammunition spilling across the ash. But those still standing scooped it up and kept moving. Farther inland, a company of Marines pinned behind a ridge heard footsteps. They braced for Japanese infantry, only to see Black Marines stumbling into view, gasping for breath, arms full of ammo. A lieutenant stared and said only, "Where the hell did you come from?" One Marine answered between breaths, "The beach. Where you need us." Word spread fast. A rumor reached command posts that Black Marines had made it across 500 yards of open fire to resupply trapped units. Men who'd never seen them before shouted thanks, slapped shoulders, shook hands. In war, gratitude sounds like survival. But the Japanese saw them too and adjusted. Snipers focused on the ammo carriers. Mortar teams timed their fire for when supply lines moved. One mortar burst sent shrapnel ripping through a belt of 30 cal rounds a Marine carried, detonating it in a flash like fireworks. The blast bowled 2 men backward. Corpsmen dragged them into a crater and worked frantically as bullets snapped overhead. Yet even wounded, some refused evacuation. Private First Class Eugene Groves wrapped a blood-soaked bandage around his thigh, stood up shakily, and limped toward another pile of crates. "Men up there need this," he muttered. He wasn't alone. The ground shook with artillery. The black sand was so soft that men sank ankle-deep when they tried to run. But still they hauled ammunition until the veins in their arms bulged and their lungs burned. Afternoon turned the island into a furnace. The sun beat down, reflecting off lava rock until the heat felt like it was cooking them inside their uniforms. Sweat poured down faces, mixing with gritty ash. Canteens ran dry fast. The Japanese Air Force tried a low strafing run. Zeros screamed overhead, guns chattering. But Navy fighters intercepted them in a high spiral of contrails and fire. Marines on the ground didn't look up. They had no strength left for awe. That evening, before darkness fell, the Japanese unleashed a counterattack. Infantry burst from hidden tunnels, throwing grenades and charging with bayonets. The front line reeled. Heavy machine guns roared. Mortars dropped like thunderclaps. The white rifle companies were nearly overrun. The order crackled through the chaos. Any Marine who can fight, form a line. That included the ammunition companies. Men who had only carried supplies grabbed rifles, grenades, bars, anything they could reach. Black Marines fell into firing positions beside white Marines, shoulders touching, no gap between them. For some, it was the first time in their lives they fought alongside each other as equals. The Japanese came screaming down the ridge. Marines opened fire. Muzzle flashes turned the volcanic dust into clouds. Grenades exploded with sickening thuds. One Black Marine leapt out of a foxhole, charging forward to drag a wounded rifleman back to safety, bullets zipping past his ears. Another steadied a Browning machine gun and held the trigger until the barrel glowed red. Bodies tumbled down the slope. The counterattack started to collapse. In the final minutes of daylight, the Japanese retreated into dark tunnels, vanishing as suddenly as they appeared. The beach was quiet again, but not peaceful. The wounded groaned. The dying whispered for water. Stretchers moved through lantern-lit haze, and the black Marines, who had been told their purpose was only to serve, not fight, now had blood on their uniforms and bullet holes in their packs. They had saved the line. When reports reached battalion command, one officer simply said, "They're Marines. And Marines don't break." On Iwo Jima, that was the only truth that mattered. Night on Iwo Jima was worse than day. In daylight, at least a man could see where death was coming from. But when darkness fell across the volcanic rock, the world shrank to the glow of burning wrecks, the flicker of signal lamps, and the distant silhouettes of Mount Suribachi looming like a black tooth against the sky. The Japanese owned the night. They crawled out of tunnel mouths no bigger than foxholes, slipping silently across ash, tossing grenades into sleeping pits, cutting throats, pulling wounded into the dark where they were never seen again. No position was safe. No unit slept more than minutes at a time. The Black Marines, worn, caked in soot, legs trembling from exhaustion, stood watch where they landed, guarding piles of ammunition stacked like fragile lifelines. These crates were as important as rifles. Without them, nobody on the island survived until morning. Every night they heard movement in the dark. Rustling ash, shifting gravel, then the sudden awful crack of a carbine. One Marine, Private Samuel Griffin, caught a flash of metal, bayonet dripping black. He fired, the muzzle flash lighting the night like lightning, the enemy collapsing inches from his boots. Nobody cheered. They simply checked their ammo and waited for the next sound. By the third night, the Japanese tried something new. They swarmed the ammo dumps directly, silent, fast, dozens at a time, hoping to blow them sky high and leave the Marines defenseless. But when they came, expecting untrained labor troops, they found Marines awake, rifles steady, foxholes linked by overlapping fire. When the Japanese charged screaming, "Banzai!" the ammunition men poured bullets into the wave. Grenades soared overhead, bursting bright, showering volcanic shards. 2 Marines went down instantly, hit in the chest by bayonets before the attackers were cut down. Others fought hand-to-hand in the dust, wrestling, choking, stabbing. When it ended, the ground was slick with blood. A corporal from the ammunition company stood shaking, his bayonet buried in the sand, breath ragged. He had never fired a weapon in anger before this week. Now he had survived a melee most infantry veterans never saw. Word of what happened traveled quickly across the beach. The ammunition companies had beaten back a full-scale nighttime assault. No supplies lost, no positions overrun. When a battalion commander inspected the perimeter, he blinked in disbelief at the piles of enemy dead. These men weren't just hauling crates anymore. They were holding ground, winning fights, saving lives. A white gunnery sergeant, grim-faced and covered in soot, looked at them with respect normally reserved for battle-scarred raiders. "You're Marines," he said quietly. "I don't care what anyone said before." The next morning, the true horror of the island became clear. Bulldozers scraped sand to clear new positions, and the blade uncovered tunnels like buried anthills, full of bodies, weapons, and explosives. The Japanese had engineered Iwo Jima into a city of traps. Marines tossed grenades into dark holes and listened to echoing screams below. Flamethrower teams advanced, clearing bunkers one inferno at a time. The ammunition companies supplied them, carrying fuel tanks and napalm cylinders on their backs even as snipers tried to pick them off. The heat from flamethrowers washed over them like blasts from an oven, lighting the tunnels in brilliant gouts of fire. When those Japanese inside ran out screaming, the Black Marines fired with grim precision. There was no mercy on either side. No one on Iwo Jima expected to leave alive. As the battle surged inland, the pace changed. Trucks finally landed, allowing supplies to move faster. But the terrain was so broken, craters, smashed ridges, melted rock, that most vehicles bogged down or flipped. The only reliable way to move ammunition was still on the backs of men. And so the ammunition companies marched again, 200-pound mortar rounds slung between pairs, belts of machine gun ammo wrapped across shoulders like armor. Their boots sank into ash, grinding volcanic grit into socks until every step felt like walking on razors. Every time they passed infantry foxholes, white Marines raised hands calling out thanks, asking how the beach looked, who was still alive, whether mail would ever arrive. Respect had replaced doubt. It was on the 4th day that they faced the worst barrage yet. Japanese artillery hidden deep in caves opened fire on the beach in sustained bombardment, shell after shell slamming into the soft black earth, hurling sand into the sky as high as a two-story building. The first explosions tore open ammo stacks, igniting mortar rounds in a chain reaction of blasts. The ground heaved. Marines were flung into the air like ragdolls. Men scrambled, trying to drag crates to safety while shrapnel shrieked overhead. Someone shouted, "Spread the stores! Get them apart!" And Marines sprinted under fire to break up the piles, knowing if one went up, the entire beach might follow. One Marine, Private Harold Baker, threw himself atop a crate that had caught fire, smothering the flames with his own body because he knew if it ignited, everyone near him would die. Another Marine dragged him away as the wood smoked, the blast narrowly avoided. There were no medals in that moment, just survival. Hours later, the beach was a graveyard of burned-out crates, twisted metal, charred bodies. Yet somehow enough ammunition survived to continue the fight. Enough because these men refused to abandon their work. When dusk came, men sat in silence, leaning on crates like pillowless beds. The chaplain moved among them, offering water and prayers. Some Marines cried quietly, the strain of the past days finally breaking through. Yet no one asked to leave the island. No one asked to be replaced. Every man who had doubted them, every officer, every rifleman, every skeptic, now saw what the enemy saw. These Marines did not quit. And while medals would come later, praise would come later, history would come later, their reality was simple. Without the Black Marines on Iwo Jima, men on the front lines would have run out of ammunition and died where they stood. The island would have devoured them all. The Marines of the 8th Ammunition Company and 36th Depot Company had become the beating heart of the battlefield. Japan's mocks, America's prejudice, none of it mattered anymore. The only proof that counted was paid for in blood, sweat, gunpowder, and volcanic ash. That night, as tracer rounds arced like lightning into the sky and the ocean waves hissed on broken steel, a white lieutenant from the 4th Division walked to the ammunition perimeter, removed his helmet, and said simply, "We couldn't do this without you." And every man within earshot knew it was true. The island did not get easier. It only got stranger. By the end of the first week, Marines understood that Iwo Jima was not just a battlefield, it was a labyrinth. Every hill was hollow. Every patch of ground might hide a tunnel entrance. An entire regiment could vanish underground and reappear miles away. When Marines pushed forward, Japanese troops tunneled behind them. Positions thought secured erupted with gunfire hours later. On other beaches in the Pacific, battles moved forward. On Iwo Jima, the battle surrounded you. The ammunition companies were exhausted beyond human limits. Their shoulders were raw from crate straps rubbing flesh. Their fingers split and bled from carrying ammunition with no gloves. When they swallowed, their throats burned with volcanic dust that coated teeth like sandpaper. Nights brought no rest, only more work. They dug new positions, hauled supplies, and guarded the wounded. But the worst was yet to come, the attacks on the beach from Mount Suribachi. The massive volcanic cone overlooked everything. Japanese artillery hidden beneath it had clear sight of every landing zone. On the morning of February 23rd, Marine forward observers began radioing the beach with frantic urgency. "Prepare, Suribachi is waking up." Then the bombardment began. Shells screamed overhead and slammed into the beach with horrifying force. Craters blew open like boiling cauldrons. Marines were tossed through the air, limbs ragdolling. Ammunition crates splintered into thousands of shards. Sand turned to black mist under the pressure of explosions. The ground shook hard enough to knock men off their feet. And through it all, Black Marines crawled through the barrage, dragging crates one by one, refusing to abandon their mission. Some died carrying ammunition. Some died shielding it. A white officer, stunned, watched them sprint through flying shrapnel to reach a machine gun crew that was nearly out of belts. One of those Marines, a private named Theodore Ragland, was hit in the leg mid-run. He limped the rest of the way and threw the belts to the gunner before collapsing. The gunner cinched them in and opened fire, cutting down a Japanese charge. When medics reached Ragland, he whispered, "Don't lose the crates," and tried to stand again. But then, something changed. The shelling slowed. Marines inland were reporting a surge up the slopes of Suribachi. The entire beach went silent, waiting. Breath held, unsure if another attack was moments away. Then a radio crackled. One message. One moment. One sight that stopped every heart. A flag was rising. Small. Fragile. just cloth on a pipe. But on Iwo Jima, that sight was impossible. On the beach, hundreds of Marines, black, white, wounded, exhausted, stood up from foxholes and looked toward the volcano. Men who hadn't smiled in days began laughing, cheering, crying. Some dropped to their knees. Others stared upward with disbelief painted across soot-covered faces. And then came the second flag, bigger, brighter, carried up by a squad who refused to let the first be lost. Joe Rosenthal's camera captured the moment. But long before that picture became a symbol, Black Marines on the beach saw it with their own eyes and understood. Suribachi had fallen, but the battle wasn't over. Not even close. With Suribachi secured, U.S. forces split the island in half. The Japanese responded with the fiercest resistance yet. Night attacks, tunnel raids, suicide charges. Ammunition demand skyrocketed. Machine guns burned through belts faster than crates could arrive. Mortars fired without pause. The ammunition companies now moved farther inland, carrying supplies through territory that changed by the hour. They crawled through trenches slick with blood, ducked sniper fire, and crossed open zones turned to killing fields. They stepped over corpses, Japanese and American, and did not stop. On one nightmare day, a white rifle platoon became pinned down behind a broken ridge. Japanese troops flanked them, firing from hidden caves. Their bar gunner was dead. Their ammo was gone. They radioed back, expecting a rifle squad to reinforce them. Instead, 3 Black Marines appeared, running full speed, bent beneath the weight of mortar rounds. They skidded into the crater and began handing out ammunition. The platoon leader yelled at them to get down, but they were already moving again, sprinting for the next foxhole. Bullets hit the ground around their boots like hammer strikes. One fell hit in the back. The other 2 kept going, refusing to let the line collapse. When the smoke cleared, the riflemen saw that the crates had saved them. Those men would never forget the faces of the Marines who risked everything for strangers. Farther down the line, the ammunition companies received a new duty, retrieving the wounded. Any Marine of any unit left in the open had to be carried back. Men who had spent days hauling crates now hauled blood-soaked stretchers. They dragged comrades through craters, ran through fire, and shielded the helpless with their own bodies. For every man they saved, another fell to snipers or artillery. Yet they kept moving, eyes stinging, lungs burning, legs numb from fatigue. Something had changed in the Marines of Iwo Jima. Color did not matter. Only survival did, and word traveled. Inside foxholes, white Marines talked about them with respect older generations had never spoken. Officers wrote reports praising their courage. Radio operators mentioned them in transmissions to headquarters. Even hardened veterans, men from Guadalcanal and Saipan, finally understood what prejudice had tried to hide. These Marines were among the bravest on the island. By the 10th day, the ammunition companies were doing work no manual ever described. They weren't just carriers, they were fighters, rescuers, defenders, and symbols of something larger than any campaign. When Japanese forces launched one last desperate night assault, the ammunition perimeter held firm. Black Marines, rifles steady, fired until barrels glowed red. They tossed grenades into charging masses. They pulled wounded back into cover. They gave commands, not just followed them. When dawn broke, bodies lay in rows across the ash. The beach was silent again. One white Marine sergeant walked the line, shaking hands with the survivors. When he reached a soot-covered private who had fired until his ammo ran dry, he said, voice cracking, "I'd fight beside you any day." On Iwo Jima, respect was no longer an idea. It was earned in blood, fire, smoke, and volcanic sand. When the final weeks on Iwo Jima came, there was no triumph left in anyone's eyes. Victory on this island did not look like banners or speeches. It looked like broken bodies, silent craters, and Marines who no longer recognized their own voices when they tried to speak. But still, every morning the ammunition companies rose, shouldered crates heavier than their own weight, and walked back into the fire. By now, the 8th Ammunition Company and 36th Depot Company had earned a reputation that stretched from beach to command post. White riflemen called them their lifeline. Officers praised them in after-action reports. The Navy, watching from offshore, saw their silhouettes moving through explosions and whispered, "How are they still alive?" Even the Japanese, eavesdropping on captured radios, realized the same truth their propaganda had denied. These Marines did not break. The battlefield shifted north, where the ground was jagged and cruel, full of ravines and cliffs where the Japanese had built new kill zones. Every advance came under sniper fire. Machine guns rattled from invisible holes. Mortars landed so close the blast hurled men against rocks like rag dolls. The ammunition companies moved anyway, crawling on elbows, pushing crates forward inch by inch, then running through open fire to get them to the guns. When mortar crews fired nonstop for hours, these men ran ammunition chains like human conveyor belts, passing shells hand to hand until their palms bled and their shoulders locked. Some Marines collapsed from exhaustion. Others fell asleep sitting upright, rifles still in their laps. The chaplain carried a water bucket from man to man, touching shoulders, whispering prayers. No one talked about racism anymore. On Iwo Jima, the dead were the same color. The wounded bled the same. The living held the same 1,000-yard stare. Then came the worst day of all. North of the airfields, a ridge so scarred by artillery it looked like it had been clawed apart by giants became the center of the fight. Rifle companies sprinted forward only to be chewed up by hidden guns. Ammunition vanished faster than it could be carried. Command radios screamed for mortar rounds, grenades, and 30 cal belts. The ammunition companies were ordered forward again. They didn't hesitate. Black Marines and white Marines ran side by side across open ground, where every step felt like walking across a firing range. Bullets shredded canteens. Fragmentation tore holes in packs. One Marine went down, then another, but the line kept moving. When they reached the ridge, the infantry erupted in cheers. They had been moments from being overrun. Mortars began firing again. Machine guns opened up. Grenadiers lobbed explosive after explosive into tunnel mouths. And for a moment, just a moment, the Marines on that ridge believed they might survive the day. Then the Japanese counterattacked. 20, 30, 50 enemy soldiers burst from hidden caves, charging uphill with grenades and bayonets. Marines on the ridge fired until their rifles clicked empty. Those with ammunition passed it to others without thinking about race, rank, or unit. Just survival. A black Marine from the 36th Depot Company tackled a white corporal out of the path of a bayonet, wrestling a Japanese soldier into the dust before stabbing him with his own knife. Another Marine, Private Elijah Bumpers, grabbed a flamethrower dropped by a dying infantryman. He had never fired one in his life, but he squeezed the trigger and fire washed down the ridge in a roaring wave. The Japanese charge collapsed. The survivors retreated into tunnels. The ridge held. When the smoke cleared, bodies lay everywhere. Some Marines stared blankly at their hands, unable to understand how they were still alive. The ammunition companies had saved the line again, not once, not twice, but every single time the island tried to kill them. The final Japanese offensive came at night. A massive banzai charge through ravines and broken rock. Hundreds of enemy soldiers stormed American positions in a frenzy of gunfire and screams. Ammunition ran low. Marines fought with knives, shovels, fists. The ammunition companies grabbed their rifles and stood shoulder to shoulder with the infantry, forming a line of exhausted men who refused to fall back. They fired every round they had. Then they fought hand to hand. When dawn came, the ridge was silent. No more attacks came. Soon after, word spread, Iwo Jima was secure. Not safe, never safe, but won. The beach that had eaten thousands of young men was finally still. Stretchers carried the wounded toward hospital ships. Chaplains whispered over the dead. Marines who could still walk sat in the sand and said nothing. They had no strength left for celebration, but the officers knew what these men had done. Reports went to headquarters. Recommendations went to Washington. White commanders wrote with open pride about the ammunition companies that had carried the Marine Corps on their backs. Letters home spoke of black Marines whose courage saved entire companies. For the first time in Marine history, the nation knew the truth. Black Marines had fought at Iwo Jima, and they had fought like legends. Years later, when the battle was studied, when statues were built and medals awarded, history tried to capture what happened on that island. But the men who were there remembered it simply. They remembered the volcanic sand that swallowed boots, the tunnels that breathed death, the nights full of whispers and screams, and the moment they realized that prejudice had no place on a battlefield. One Marine from the 5th Division summed it up better than any historian ever could. No Marine on Iwo Jima fought alone. Black or white, it didn't matter. We survived because those men never stopped bringing us ammunition. They were Marines, and Marines don't quit. And that was the legacy of the 8th Ammunition Company and 36th Depot Company. They came as laborers. They left as war fighters. They carried ammunition. They carried wounded. They carried the Marine Corps through the darkest days of the Pacific, and on the black sands of Iwo Jima, where fire met steel and men met death, they proved the world wrong. They were Marines, equal in courage, equal in sacrifice, equal in honor. History will never be able to forget them again.